In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And sometimes that war means jumping out of a Valkyrie into burning air, above a world that hasn't heard the Emperor's name in 3 years, watching the man who owes you 3 thrones and a bottle of Amasek fall 4,000 meters without a shoot. That was the first 30 seconds. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about taking back what chaos took, or trying to. This is Private Jevrik Cohl, Morghaven 12th Drop Infantry, 19 years old, 22 months in uniform, with a combat record that consists of 2 feral groks and a crate of ration packs he hit by accident. And now he's falling through the sky above Prathenmire, a hive world of 62 billion that went silent 3 years ago and has been alone with whatever chaos does to a world when no one is coming. This is what reclamation looks like from the inside, not from a command throne, from a rooftop covered in something warm that isn't metal, in corridors carved with writing that shifts when the light moves, where the shadows don't behave and the angles aren't right, and the sergeant says one thing that matters: do not look at the walls. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The ramp dropped and the world became noise. I want to tell you it was like something you can prepare for, that the drills back on Morghaven, the endless repetitions of stand, hook, jump, fall, roll, that any of it matters when the sky itself is trying to kill you. It does not. Nothing prepares you for the moment when the Valkyrie's rear hatch blows open and you see what is waiting below, and your body is already moving because the sergeant behind you has his boot in your back, and the only direction left is down and out, into the screaming air above a world that has forgotten the Emperor's name. Prathenmire. That was the name on the briefing slate. Hive World, 62 billion souls at last census, which was conducted 11 years before the astropathic distress signals stopped. By the time the Morghaven 12th Drop Infantry received deployment orders, Prathenmire had been silent for 3 years. 3 years of nothing. 3 years of whatever chaos does to a world when no one is coming to help. And now we were coming, 4,800 drop troopers in a first wave meant to secure a landing zone on the upper hab-sprawl of Hive Vrannek, so the real army could follow. The Astra Militarum, in all its grinding, beautiful, stupid enormity, funneled through us, through the ones who jump first. I was 19, standard Terran years old. I had been a soldier for 22 months. I had fired my las rifle in combat exactly once before, at a perimeter breach on a supply station where the enemy turned out to be feral groks that had gotten into the munitions yard. My kill count was 2 groks and a crate of ration packs I hit by accident. That was the sum total of my combat experience when Sergeant Orrund Pael shoved me toward the ramp and I fell forward into the hot, brown, stinking air above Prathenmire, and the flak started reaching for us like fingers made of light and shrapnel. The Valkyrie banked hard to port the instant the last of us cleared the ramp. I know this because I saw it happen while I was spinning, my grav chute fighting the thermals that boiled up from the burning hive below. I saw the aircraft pull away, and I saw the second Valkyrie in our formation, the one carrying 3rd Squad, take a direct hit from something large and bright that came up from the haze. It did not explode the way you see in the propaganda reels, where the aircraft becomes a clean fireball and the narrator says something about noble sacrifice. It broke. The fuselage cracked open like a dropped egg and things fell out of it. Shapes that tumbled and pinwheeled and grew smaller against the fire-lit clouds. Some of them had grav chutes that deployed. Most did not. I watched Drace Mernith, who I had played cards with 6 hours earlier, and who owed me 3 thrones and a bottle of Amasec, fall without a chute for what must have been 4,000 meters. I did not see him land. The hive swallowed him somewhere in the tangle of spires and smokestacks, and the brown murk that hung over everything like a burial shroud. That was the first 30 seconds. My name is Jevrik Cohl. I am a private in the Morghaven 12th Drop Infantry, 2nd Company, 1st Platoon, 2nd Squad. Or I was. The unit designations stopped meaning much after the first 6 hours on Prathenmire, when the neat organizational charts that the command staff had drawn up in orbit began to dissolve the way everything dissolves on a chaos world, slowly at first and then all at once, until you cannot remember what shape things were supposed to be. But I am getting ahead of myself. I need to tell this properly. I need to tell it in order, because if I do not, I will start skipping to the parts that keep me awake, and then none of it will make sense to anyone who was not there. The grav chute brought me down onto a rooftop, not the landing zone. The landing zone was supposed to be a broad habitation plateau on the 206th level of Hive Vrannek's western face, a flat expanse of prefabricated housing blocks with good sight lines and minimal cover for enemy forces. That is what the briefing said. What the briefing did not say was that the entire western face of the hive had been burning for what looked like weeks, and the thermal updrafts had scattered our drop across 9 vertical levels and Emperor knows how many horizontal kilometers. I came down on a roof covered in some kind of blistered gray skin that was not metal and was not rockite and was not anything I wanted to think about too hard. It gave slightly under my boots. It was warm through my soles. I unclipped the grav chute with shaking hands and brought my las rifle up the way we had been trained, stock to shoulder, barrel sweeping left to right. There was nothing to shoot at, just the roof and the skin and the noise. Throne of terror, the noise. Prathenmire sounded like an animal in pain, the deep structural groaning of a hive city whose infrastructure was failing, the constant low roar of fires from below, the snap and whine of weapons fire echoing up through ventilation shafts and hab corridors, and underneath all of it, something else. A sound I did not have a name for then, a rhythmic pulse, almost too low to hear, that I felt in my teeth and in my sternum more than I heard with my ears. It was coming from deeper in the hive, from below, from the core. I found Ossev Greth on the next rooftop over, tangled in his grav chute lines and swearing in a continuous monotone that was almost impressive in its lack of variation. Ossev was my bunkmate. He was 20 standard, 1 year older than me, and the calmest person I had ever met in circumstances that did not involve falling out of an aircraft. When our feet were on the ground, he spoke quietly and smiled a lot, and had a way of making you feel like everything was going to work out, even when the evidence strongly suggested otherwise. When our feet were not on the ground, or when things were exploding, he became a different person entirely, all white knuckles and profanity. I cut him free with my field knife, and he stood up and looked around and said a single word that I will not repeat, because my mother raised me to believe that some things should not be recorded for posterity. And then he checked his las rifle and nodded at me, and that was that. We were alive. We were on the roof. The war was somewhere below us, and we needed to find it before it found us. We moved down through a roof hatch that had been left open, or blown open, into the building below. It was a hab-block, or it had been. The interior was dark and the lumens were dead, and we used the stab lights on our las rifles to navigate a corridor that was covered, floor to ceiling and walls, in writing. Not painted, not printed, carved, Someone had taken a blade or a tool and carved words into every surface, small and tight and overlapping, layer upon layer of script that I could not read because it was in no language I had ever seen. The letters, if they were letters, seemed to shift when the light moved across them. I told myself it was a trick of shadow and angle. Ossev did not say anything about the writing at all. He just walked faster. 3 floors down, we found what was left of Corporal Hanneth and 2 troopers from 4th Squad, whose names I did not know. Hanneth was our squad's heavy weapons operator, a thick-necked woman from the Morghaven northern reaches who could field strip a heavy bolter in under 40 seconds and who had a tattoo of the Aquila on her left forearm that she had done herself with a sewing needle and engine ink when she was 15. She was sitting against a wall with her heavy bolter across her knees and blood running down her face from a gash across her forehead, and the 2 4th Squad troopers were pulling security on the corridor junction ahead. When she saw us, she grinned, and the grin was red with blood, and she said, "Cohl, Greth, took you long enough. There is something wrong with this place." That was the most obvious thing anyone said on Prathenmire, and it was the most necessary, because hearing someone else say it meant it was not just in my head. Something was wrong. Not just the writing on the walls, not just the skin on the roof. The air was wrong. It tasted like copper and something sweeter underneath, something cloying that stuck to the back of my throat. The shadows were wrong. They did not behave the way shadows should behave when you move a light source. They lagged. They lingered, they pooled in corners and stayed there, even when you pointed your stab light directly at them, as if the darkness had weight and substance and preferred certain places. The geometry of the corridors was wrong in ways that I could feel but not articulate. Angles that should have been right angles were not. Walls that should have been parallel converged slightly if you looked at them long enough. Doorways that should have been rectangular had a subtle lean to them that made you feel, on some deep animal level, like you were about to fall sideways. Chaos does not simply conquer a place. It eats it, it digests it, and excretes something new. Something that looks almost like what was there before, but is not. And the almost is the worst part. If it were entirely alien, you could process it. You could say this is another place and apply different rules. But it is not another place. It is the same hab-block, the same corridor, the same door you might have walked through 1,000 times if you had lived here. Except now the door is wrong and the corridor is wrong and the place where your home was is a mouth. And it is smiling at you with teeth that used to be familiar things. We found Sergeant Pael 4 levels further down, at the head of a group of 11. He had gathered pieces of 5 different squads, anyone he could find from the scattered drop. His face was gray with dust and his eyes were hard, and he did not waste time on greetings. "Cohl, Hanneth, you are with me. We are moving west toward the primary landing zone. Comms are intermittent. I have had partial contact with Lieutenant Gravan, who is consolidating forces at what he believes is the 204th level junction. We will link up, establish a perimeter, and wait for reinforcement drops. Stay tight. Watch the corners. Do not look at the walls." That last instruction was the one that told me Pael had already seen things in this place. Do not look at the walls. Such a simple order. Such an impossible one to follow when the walls are covered in carvings that pull at your eyes and the shadows move in ways that peripheral vision catches, but direct sight cannot. And you are 19 years old and afraid, and the only thing keeping you from screaming is the weight of the las rifle in your hands and the sound of boots on metal around you, the proof that you are not alone. We moved west, 16 of us now, through corridors and down stairwells and across junction spaces that had been market plazas or communal areas once. You could tell from the layout, the stall frames still standing, the benches, The public address speakers mounted on poles that were now broadcasting a low, wet sound like labored breathing. We moved in formation, Pael at the front with 2 troopers on point, the rest strung out behind, Hanneth in the middle with the heavy bolter, because she was our only real firepower, and you protect your heavy weapons the way you protect your water supply, with your life if necessary. We made contact 12 minutes into the march. I know it was 12 minutes because I checked my chronometer when we started, and I checked it again when the shooting began, and the numbers stayed in my head the way certain numbers do, the ones that mark the boundaries between who you were and who you are about to become. They came from a side corridor. Not soldiers, not at first glance. They were people, civilians. Men and women in the ragged remains of hab clothing, workers' coveralls, shift uniforms, the everyday dress of a hive world population. They came around the corner in a loose crowd, maybe 30 of them, and for a half-second that lasted a century. I thought they were refugees, survivors, people who had been hiding in the hive for 3 years waiting for rescue. And here we were, the Astra Militarum, the Emperor's hammer, come to save them. Then I saw their faces. I do not want to describe their faces. I have to, because this is the story and their faces are part of it. But I want you to know that I do not want to. They were smiling, all of them. The same smile, wide and fixed and showing too many teeth, as if someone had taken a knife to the corners of their mouths and opened them wider than mouths are meant to go. Their eyes were open but wrong, pupils blown out to the edges of the iris so that their eyes looked black, solid black, and they were moving in a way that was almost normal but not quite, the rhythm of their steps slightly off, slightly too synchronized, as if they were all hearing the same music that we could not hear. Pael opened fire. No warning, no challenge, no attempt to communicate. He brought his las rifle up and put a las bolt through the forehead of the closest one, a woman who had been wearing a Factorum shift supervisor's badge, and she went down and the rest of them screamed. Not screamed, that is not the right word. They opened those 2 wide mouths, and what came out was a sound that was not a scream. It was a chord, a harmony, multiple tones at once from each throat, a sound that a human voice should not be able to make. And then they charged. They had no weapons. They had hands. Hands with nails that had grown long and thick and dark, and they were fast, faster than people should be, crossing the distance in a scrambling rush that ate up the space between us before half the squad had even started firing. I shot. I remember pulling the trigger and seeing the last bolt hit someone's chest and seeing them stagger but not fall, not immediately. The beam leaving a blackened hole, but the body continuing forward for 2 more steps before the legs gave out. I shot again, and again. The corridor filled with light and noise, and the stink of burned meat and scorched metal, and still they came, climbing over their own dead, that smile never leaving their faces. Those black eyes fixed on us with something that was not hatred, and was not hunger, but was something else, something I could not name, something like joy. Hanneth opened up with the heavy bolter, and that was the end of it. The heavy bolter does not discriminate, and it does not negotiate. It converts living things into wet components and scattered debris, and the corridor became a slaughterhouse in the space of 5 seconds. When the firing stopped and the echoes died, there were 30 bodies on the ground, none of them whole, and the walls were painted in a new color that ran down over the carved writing and pooled on the floor and mixed with the dust. I stood there, breathing, shaking, alive. Ossev put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed once. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His hand was shaking too. Sergeant Pael walked forward, stepping over the dead, and knelt beside one of the bodies. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood up and turned to face us, and his expression was something I had never seen on his face before, and hope never to see on any face again. A kind of calm that was worse than fear, because it meant he had passed through fear and out the other side, into a place where he understood exactly how bad this was going to be. "Those were civilians," he said, "or they were before. They have been turned, all of them, every one. Whatever happened to this hive, it did not just take the garrison and the PDF. It took everyone." He paused. He looked down the corridor into the dark that waited beyond the reach of our stab lights. "Command said we were retaking a hive world. Command said there would be resistance from heretic forces and possible cult activity. Command did not say the entire population had been converted." Another pause. "Adjust your expectations accordingly. Adjust your expectations. On Morghaven, when the wind shifts and a storm comes in off the plateau faster than the forecast predicted, the old hands say something similar. They say, adjust your footing. It means the same thing. It means what you thought was going to happen is not going to happen, and what is going to happen is going to be worse. And the only thing you can control is how you stand when it hits you." We adjusted. We moved on. What else could we do? We were drop troopers of the Morghaven 12th. We had jumped out of a perfectly functional aircraft into the upper reaches of a corrupted hive city on a world that had been eating itself for 3 years. And the only way out was down, into the hive, toward the landing zone, toward the rest of the regiment, toward whatever was waiting for us in the dark. The next 2 hours were an education in the meaning of the word hell, not the metaphorical hell of difficult circumstances or unpleasant conditions. The actual, literal, theological hell that the ecclesiarchy warns about in their sermons, the place where the faithless go when they die, the place where reality bends and breaks and the things that live in the spaces between stars reach through and touch the material world with fingers made of madness and malice. Hive Vrannek was becoming that place. It was in the process of transformation, half digested by whatever powers had claimed it, and we were moving through its guts like parasites in the belly of a beast that was still very much alive. We encountered the changed civilians 4 more times in those 2 hours. Each time it was the same. The 2 wide smiles, the black eyes, the charging rush, and the harmonic scream. Each time we put them down faster, more efficiently, with less hesitation. That is what combat does to you. It files away the parts of your mind that want to ask questions and leaves only the parts that react, assess, and fire. By the 4th encounter, I was not thinking about who these people had been. I was not imagining their lives before, the shifts they worked, the food they ate, the children they raised. I was thinking about center mass and rate of fire and how many shots it took to drop a corrupted human at 10 meters versus 20. The answer, in case you are wondering, is 2 at 20 meters and 1 at 10 if you hit the torso. Headshots dropped them instantly, but heads are small targets in a dark corridor when your hands are shaking and your heart is beating so hard you can feel it in your fingertips. Ossev handled it differently than I did. He did not go quiet and mechanical the way I did. He talked, not to me, not to anyone specific. He just narrated, a low murmur under his breath that I could hear when we were moving close together. Describing what he was seeing, what he was doing, as if turning it into words made it manageable, made it something that could be filed and stored, rather than something that lived in his chest and grew. Corridor junction ahead, 3 contacts left side, firing, 2 down. 3rd one is crawling, firing again, clear, like a report to no one, like a prayer in the language of violence. I did not tell him to stop. I think it was keeping him sane. I think if he had stopped talking, the silence inside his head would have been too large and too dark, and he would have drowned in it. Sergeant Pael led us through the hive with a sureness that I found both comforting and disturbing. He had a map on his data slate, pulled from the orbital surveys, but the map was increasingly unreliable. Corridors that should have connected did not. Stairwells that should have descended instead went sideways, or curved in directions that made no spatial sense. Doors opened onto rooms that were too large for the spaces they occupied, rooms that should have been small hab units, but stretched away into distances that the stab lights could not reach. Pael navigated by instinct and by the Morghaven plateau walker's trick of always knowing which way was down. Gravity, at least, still worked. Mostly. It was during the descent through a main arterial corridor, a wide transit passage that would have carried thousands of workers between shift rotations in the hive's living days, that we found our first real evidence of what had happened to Prathenmire. The corridor was large enough for vehicles, broad and high-ceilinged, with tramway rails set into the floor, and junction lights still flickering in their housings overhead, casting a stuttering amber glow that was worse than darkness because it showed you things and then took them away. The walls here were not carved with writing. They were decorated. Bones. Human bones, sorted by type and arranged in patterns on the wall surfaces with a precision that spoke of patience and purpose. Femurs laid in radiating lines, ribs curved into spirals, skulls set at the intersection points, eye sockets facing the corridor, watching us pass. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. More bones than the bodies we had seen could account for, which meant they had been brought here from elsewhere in the hive, collected and carried and assembled by hands that had once worked factorum lines and operated cargo lifters and held children. Nobody spoke as we walked through the bone corridor. There was nothing to say. You could feel it pressing on you, the weight of all those dead, the enormity of what had been done to them and by whom and for what purpose. I looked at the skull patterns and tried not to see faces. I looked at the bone spirals and tried not to see the symbol they were forming, because they were forming something, a shape that repeated and grew as we moved deeper, a shape that my eyes did not want to hold and my mind did not want to process. An 8-pointed star, the star of chaos undivided, rendered in the bones of Prathenmire's own people. Trooper Hallam, one of the 4th Squad survivors, started praying, not quietly. He started praying in a loud, cracked voice, the litany of protection, the words tumbling out of him, fast and desperate. Pael let him pray for 10 seconds and then said, "Hallam, quiet, sound discipline." Hallam stopped praying with his mouth. I could see his lips still moving. I understood his impulse. I wanted to pray too, but I have never been good at prayer. On Morghaven, we are taught the standard devotions, the catechisms of the Imperial Creed, the litanies, and the psalms of the Emperor Ascendant, but they always felt like someone else's words in my mouth. I believed in the Emperor. I believe in the Emperor. That is not the issue. The issue is that belief, for me, has always been a quiet thing, a low fire in the chest that does not need to be stoked with words. When I pray, I do it in silence, in the space between thoughts, and what I say is not a litany but a statement of fact. I am here. You put me here. Help me do what needs to be done. That is the entirety of my theology. It has gotten me this far. Whether it will get me further remains to be determined. We reached the junction where Lieutenant Gravan was consolidating forces after 3 hours and 40 minutes of moving through the hive. The junction was a major intersection point where 6 arterial corridors converged on a central plaza that had been a market district. Gravan had set up a defensive perimeter using overturned market stalls and cargo containers, and when we arrived, there were already nearly 80 troopers inside the perimeter, drawn from at least 7 different squads. 80 out of the 460 that second company had dropped, less than 20%, and this was supposed to be the main rally point. Lieutenant Graven was a thin man with a long face and a precise way of speaking that made everything he said sound like it had been drafted and revised before it left his mouth. He was competent. I want to be clear about that. He was not a fool and he was not a coward, and what happened later was not because of any failing in his character. He was a competent officer who had been handed an impossible situation and was doing his best to impose order on it, and the fact that the situation was beyond the capacity of any mortal officer to control does not diminish the effort he made. He briefed us in clipped, efficient sentences while his adjutant handed out ammunition packs and water rations. The situation was this. The drop had been a disaster. Anti-air fire had been far heavier than intelligence had predicted, and the thermal disruption from the burning sections of the hive had scattered the descent patterns badly. Of Second Company's 460 troopers, Graven had confirmed contact with approximately 200. The rest were missing, dead, or scattered across sections of the hive that we could not reach. First Company had fared slightly better and was consolidating on the 206th level as originally planned. Third Company had taken catastrophic losses during the drop itself, with at least 6 Valkyries confirmed destroyed by ground fire before their troopers could deploy. Regimental Command was in orbit aboard the troop ship Resurgent Blade and was aware of the situation but could not commit reinforcement drops until the anti-air threat was suppressed, which required ground forces to locate and neutralize the gun positions, which required the ground forces that could not be deployed because of the anti-air threat. A circle of impossibility that would be funny if it were not killing us. The plan, such as it was, involved a two-pronged advance. First Company would push east along the 206th level toward the anti-air positions that orbital scans had identified on the eastern face of the hive. Our consolidated Second Company remnant would push down, deeper into the hive, toward the 200th level, where the primary transit hub connected Hive Vrannek's upper and lower sections. Control that hub and you controlled movement through the hive. You could cut off reinforcement from below. You could establish a strong point that the follow-up forces could use as a staging area when they finally got boots on the ground. Down. We were going down, into the hive, toward the source of the low pulse that I could still feel in my bones, the heartbeat of something vast and patient that was waiting in the dark below us. I ate a ration bar while Graven was briefing us. It tasted like cardboard and salt, and it was the best thing I had ever eaten because eating it meant I was alive and had a functioning digestive system and was still a human being doing human things in a place that was trying very hard to make human things irrelevant. Ossev sat beside me and ate his own ration bar and did not narrate the experience, which I took as a sign that he was calming down. His hands had stopped shaking. Mine had not. First time, he asked me, and I did not know if he meant first combat or first time being terrified or first time eating a ration bar in a bone-decorated market hall on a chaos world. All 3 answers were yes. First time, I said. He nodded. Me too. A pause. Thought it would be different. Different how? I thought there would be more shouting, officers giving speeches. The whole thing feels more like plumbing than war. We are just moving through pipes and fixing blockages. That was Ossev. That was his particular gift. He could take the worst thing you had ever experienced and find an angle on it that made it small enough to hold without burning your hands. Not by dismissing it, not by pretending it was fine, just by finding the ordinary inside the extraordinary and holding it up like a lantern. Plumbing. We were doing plumbing. The pipes were full of monsters, and the blockages were made of bones, and the water pressure was la fire, but the basic principle was the same. You go in, you clear it out, you move on to the next junction. Tolvet Hinn, our squad medic, found us in the market hall. She had come down 3 levels west of the landing zone and had spent the last 4 hours alone, moving through the hive by herself, navigating by the sound of gunfire. Alone, for 4 hours, in that place. When she walked into the perimeter, she was steady and calm, and her uniform was clean, and her las rifle was charged, and the only sign that anything unusual had happened to her was that her left hand was bandaged, and she would not tell anyone how she had been injured. She sat down with us and accepted a ration bar and ate it in small, measured bites, and said, "The lower levels are worse. I came through the 202nd. The architecture is—" She paused, searching for a word. "Unreliable." "Unreliable how?" Pael asked. "Rooms that should not exist. Corridors that loop. I walked the same stretch of hallway 3 times before I realized I was going in circles. The markings on the walls were changing between passes." She said this the way someone might describe a malfunctioning lift or a jammed door mechanism. A technical problem. An inconvenience. Tolvet Hinn was the most terrifying person in our squad, not because she was aggressive or loud, but because nothing seemed to reach her. She processed horror the way a filtration system processes contaminated water, taking it in, extracting what was useful, and passing the rest through without retention. I never knew if that was strength or damage. I suspect it was both. We had 40 minutes in the market hall before Gravan ordered the advance. 40 minutes to rest, redistribute ammunition, treat wounds, and compose ourselves. I used 10 of those minutes to check my equipment and 20 to sit with my back against a cargo container and stare at the ceiling and breathe. The ceiling of the market hall was high and vaulted, and in the flickering amber light I could see that it had been painted once, with a mural depicting the Emperor in his aspect as the provider, surrounded by images of abundance and industry. The paint was peeling and discolored, but the image was still recognizable, and I stared at it and tried to find the quiet fire in my chest, the belief that had always been there, the certainty that there was a purpose behind the suffering and a hand guiding the species through the dark. I found it. Barely. A coal rather than a flame. But it was there. Then Gravan gave the order, and we stood up and formed into our advance columns and began the descent into the lower hive, and the ceiling with its painted emperor disappeared behind us, and the dark closed in, and the pulse from below grew stronger with every level we dropped. We were 206 troopers moving into a hive that had housed 62 billion people and had been given to chaos for 3 years. The mathematics of that equation did not need to be spoken aloud. Everyone understood. We went down, into the hive, into the dark, into what was waiting. The descent from the 204th level to the 200th took us the better part of 18 hours, 4 levels. On a healthy hive, that distance would take a cargo lift 30 seconds. On foot, using the main arterial stairways, maybe an hour. We took 18 because every floor was a battle and every corridor was a question, and every door we opened might contain salvation or annihilation, and there was no way to know which until you were already through it. The first engagement on the descent was at the top of Stairwell 97 West, a broad industrial stairway designed for mass personnel movement between levels. Gravan had sent a forward element of 20 troopers to secure the stairwell entrance, and they walked into an ambush that killed 8 of them in the first volley. Not the corrupted civilians this time. Soldiers, traitor guard, men and women in uniforms that had once been Prathenmire Planetary Defense Force standard issue. Gray-green fatigues with the Hive City cog and tower emblem on the shoulder. except the emblem had been defaced and replaced with symbols that hurt to look at, scratched into the fabric with what might have been blood or might have been something worse. They had less guns, and they had autoguns, and they had discipline. They fired from prepared positions in the stairwell, interlocking fields of fire that turned the top landing into a kill zone, and our forward element walked straight into it, because the scouts who should have identified the ambush had vanished somewhere between the market hall and the stairwell and were never found. The fight for Stairwell 97 West lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of lass fire and frag grenades and screaming in the dark. 2 hours of Hanneth pouring heavy bolter rounds down the stairwell, and the traitors pouring lass fire back up it, and the stairwell walls becoming pockmarked and molten, and the air filling with the sharp electric stink of superheated metal and the wet stink of ruptured bodies. Sergeant Pael took our squad around through a service corridor, a narrow maintenance passage that ran parallel to the stairwell, and we came out on a landing 2 floors below the traitor positions. We hit them from behind, pouring fire into their line from a direction they had not prepared for, and the ambush broke. They died fighting, every one of them. They did not retreat, and they did not surrender, and they did not break and run. They turned to face us, and they kept firing until they were dead, and the expressions on their faces when we put them down were not the mindless smiles of the corrupted civilians. They were lucid, they were aware. They had chosen this. They had looked at the Emperor's light, and they had looked at the other thing, the thing that lived in the dark, and they had made a choice, and they were dying for that choice with the same conviction that we were killing for ours. That bothered me more than the civilians. The civilians were victims. You could tell yourself they had been taken against their will, changed by forces they could not resist, puppets dancing on strings made of warp stuff. But the traitor guard were not puppets. They were people who had weighed their options and decided that chaos offered a better bargain than the Imperium. And the worst part, the part I did not want to examine but could not stop examining, was that I could almost understand it. 3 years. 3 years they had been here, on a world that the Imperium had abandoned, cut off from supply and reinforcement and hope. And something had come to them in that abandonment and offered them an alternative to starving in the dark. I am not saying they were right. I am saying I could see the shape of the logic, and seeing it frightened me more than the bone corridors and the smiling faces and the walls that bled. After the stairwell, we pushed through level 203, which had been an industrial district, manufacturum blocks and processing plants, and the infrastructure that kept a hive city functioning. The factorum halls were vast, cavernous spaces full of machinery that had been silent for years and was now running again, but running wrong. Conveyor lines that carried nothing moved in jerking, irregular rhythms. Presses stamped down on empty beds with a sound like heartbeats. Smelting furnaces glowed with a light that was not heat light, but something colder, something that came from no fuel source that I could identify. The machines were running on something. I did not want to know what. Ossev, walking beside me, stopped narrating when we entered the factorum district. The silence from him was more unsettling than the narration had been. We lost 12 troopers clearing the manufactorum blocks, cultists hidden among the machinery, using the noise and the moving parts as cover, darting out to fire autoguns or throw crude explosive charges before vanishing into the mechanical maze. It was grinding, ugly, close-quarters work, the kind of fighting where you never see the enemy for more than a second, and you fire at sounds and shadows, and hope that what falls is not wearing an Imperial uniform. I killed a man in the factorum. Not a corrupted civilian, not a mutant. A man. He came around a stamping press with an autogun, and I shot him in the chest twice, and he fell, and I walked past his body, and I did not stop. I did not check if he was dead. I did not look at his face. I was learning. Combat teaches you to stop being a person and start being a function, and the function does not mourn and does not question and does not hesitate. Hesitation is death. Grief is death. Curiosity is death. You move and you shoot and you survive, and if you are very lucky, you get to be a person again later, somewhere far from the fighting, somewhere clean, and then the grief and the curiosity and the hesitation come flooding back all at once like water breaking through a dam, and you drown in them quietly where no one can see. But that was later, in the Factorum. I was a function. Level 202 was residential, a dense warren of hab-blocks that had housed Factorum workers and their families. This was where the horror changed character. The upper levels had been terrifying in an abstract way, the corruption expressed through architecture and symbols and the altered bodies of the civilian population. Level 202 was where it became personal, because the hab-blocks still had their contents. The furniture was still there. The personal items, the pictures on the walls, family images printed on cheap cardstock, faces smiling out from a world that no longer existed, children's toys on the floor, clothing hanging in open closets, the detritus of ordinary lives interrupted, frozen in the moment of their ending, preserved like specimens in a museum of human suffering. And the walls. The walls of the hab-blocks were doing something that I do not have adequate language to describe. They were growing, not in the way that living things grow, not with the organic logic of cell division and differentiation. They were accumulating. The walls were thicker than they should have been, layers of material building up on the original surfaces, and the material was warm and faintly yielding. If you looked at it closely, and Emperor help me, I looked at it closely, you could see texture in it, pattern, the suggestion of form. Something was pressing against the wall from the other side, trying to push through, and the wall was the only thing keeping it contained. Handprints. There were handprints in the wall material, small ones. I stopped looking after I saw the small ones. We moved through level 202 in tactical silence, the only sound our boots and our breathing and the low pulse from below that was growing stronger, more distinct, developing a rhythm that your body wanted to match, your footsteps falling into its cadence without your permission. I caught myself walking in time with it and forced myself to break step, and then caught myself again 30 seconds later, back in rhythm, as if the pulse was a current and I was a swimmer trying to go against it. Private Grun, a thin woman from 6th Squad, stopped walking in one of the hab corridors. Just stopped. She stood in front of a hab unit door and stared at it, and did not move when the troopers behind her told her to keep going. Sergeant Pael went back to her and put his hand on her shoulder and said her name, and she did not respond. She was staring at the door with an expression of intense concentration, as if she was listening to something. Then she raised her hand and reached for the door handle. Pael grabbed her wrist. She turned her head and looked at him, and for a moment her eyes were wrong, the pupils too wide, too dark. And then she blinked and they were normal again, and she said, Sorry, Sergeant. I thought someone was calling my name." Pael moved her to the middle of the formation after that, between Hanneth and Tolvet, where she could be watched. She did not try to open any more doors, but I saw her lips moving as we walked, forming words that I could not hear, and her eyes kept drifting to the walls, to the handprints in the wall material, with an expression that was not fear. It was recognition. 2 corridors further on, we found them, not the smiling adults, not the synchronized masses with their too wide mouths and their black eyes. Children. A group of 11 huddled in a junction space between 2 hab-blocks in what had been a communal play area. You could tell because the floor was painted in bright colors, faded now but still visible beneath the grime. a hopscotch grid and the outline of a ball game court, and the stenciled shapes of animals that Prathenmire's children would have recognized, but that I did not, because every hive world has its own fauna and its own way of teaching the young about it. They were small. The oldest might have been 10 standard. The youngest could not have been more than 4, a tiny figure in a filthy shift dress clutching something that had been a stuffed toy and was now a shapeless lump of stained fabric. Their faces were not smiling. That was the difference. The adults smiled. The children did not. Their mouths were closed and their eyes were the same solid black as the others, but their expressions were not blank and they were not hostile. They looked at us with something that I recognized because I had worn it myself. Confusion, fear, the face of a creature that does not understand what is happening to it. The smallest one, the one with the toy, said something, a single word, a name maybe, or a plea. I could not make it out because the voice was wrong, layered, as if several mouths were speaking through one throat, but the cadence was the cadence of a child asking for help. Every person in the formation heard it. Every person stopped. Tolvet moved forward before Pael could stop her. She knelt in front of the group and ran her mediscanner over the nearest child, a boy in Factorum workers' coveralls that had been cut down to fit him, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms where the veins showed black through the skin. A branching network of dark lines like roots spreading through the tissue. Tolvet scanned him for 10 seconds. 15. Then she stood up and walked back to Pael and spoke quietly. I was close enough to hear. Cellular corruption is total. Nervous system has been completely restructured. The warp saturation in the brain tissue is higher than anything I have measured in the adult population. They are not children anymore, Sergeant. They are wearing children. Whatever is inside those bodies, it is using the shape and the voice and the behavior because it knows what those things do to us. It knows we will hesitate. Pael looked at the children. He looked for a long time. His hand went to the Aquila pendant and stayed there. Then he turned to the formation and said, "Squad, ready weapons." Nobody moved. "That is an order." I raised my las rifle. I do not know why I was able to do it. I do not know what mechanism inside me engaged to allow my arms to lift the weapon and my eye to find the sight and my finger to touch the trigger while looking at an 8-year-old girl whose black eyes were looking back at me with an expression that my brain insisted was pleading. My training and my medic and my sergeant were all telling me that the thing behind those eyes was not a girl and had not been a girl for a very long time. I do not know why I was able to do it. I only know that I did it. That when Pael gave the order to fire, I fired. That the last bolt hit the girl in the chest and she fell and did not get up, and the stuffed toy rolled out of her hand and came to rest against my boot. We killed them all, 11. It took 4 seconds. And when it was done, the silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the absence of something else, something that had been inside each of us and was now gone, cauterized, burned away by what we had just done. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. Pael picked up the stuffed toy and put it on a window ledge, gently, the way you put down something that matters, and then he turned and said, "Move out," and we moved. I want to tell you that it was necessary. I want to tell you that they were already gone, that what we killed was not children, but corruption wearing the shape of children, that Tolvet's scanner confirmed it, and that the Emperor's mercy demanded it, and that we were soldiers following a lawful order in a combat zone against hostile entities. All of these things are true. All of these things are facts. None of these things help me sleep. There is a place in my mind where 11 small bodies lie in a play area painted with bright colors, and no amount of truth and no number of facts can make that place bearable. I carry it. I will always carry it. It is the price of what I am. I did not tell anyone about the moment, 3 corridors later, when I heard my own name whispered from behind a closed door. I did not tell anyone because telling someone would have made it real, and I needed it to not be real. I needed it to be my imagination, my exhaustion, my fear playing tricks on my ears. I walked past the door, and I did not stop, and I did not listen, and I told myself that it was nothing. And the lie was thin and transparent, but I held on to it the way a drowning man holds onto a plank that is too small to support his weight, knowing it will not save him, but unable to let go. We reached level 201 at the 19-hour mark, 19 hours since the drop. We had been awake for over 30, counting the pre-drop preparations aboard the resurgent blade. The exhaustion was becoming a physical force, a weight on my limbs and a fog in my head that made everything slightly unreal, as if I was watching myself from a distance, a puppet being operated by a tired puppeteer who was losing coordination. Morghaven ordered a 2-hour rest halt in a transit junction on 201, a large open space where several corridors converged, with good sight lines and defensible approaches. We set watches. I was assigned to the second watch, which meant I could sleep for 40 minutes before I had to be eyes open. I did not sleep. I lay on the metal floor with my pack under my head and my las rifle on my chest, and I stared at the ceiling and I listened to the sounds of the hive around me, the pulse from below, the distant creak and groan of metal under stress, the occasional sharp crack of weapons fire from somewhere far away, other elements of the regiment fighting their own battles in other parts of this enormous dying structure, and voices, faint, distant, just below the threshold of intelligibility, like a conversation happening in the next room through a thick wall. I could hear the cadence of speech without being able to make out the words. Sometimes I thought it was coming from the walls, sometimes from the floor, sometimes from inside my own skull. I turned my head and looked at Ossev, who was lying on the floor beside me. His eyes were open. He was staring at the ceiling too. "You hear it?" I whispered. "The voices?" "Yes." A long pause. "I have been hearing them since the Factorum level. I think they are getting clearer." "What are they saying?" "I do not know. I do not want to know." He turned his head and looked at me, and in the dim light, his face was drawn and old, far older than 20 years. "Jevrik, whatever happens down there, on 200, at the transit hub, whatever we find, do not listen. Whatever you hear, whatever it says, whatever voice it uses, do not listen." "How do you know it will talk to us?" "Because it already is." I did not sleep. Nobody slept. We lay in the dark and listened to the voices that were not there, and waited for the order to move. And when it came, we rose and shouldered our packs, and picked up our weapons and went down, one more level, toward the transit hub that was our objective, toward the thing that was waiting in the heart of Hive Vrannek, the thing that had been calling to us since we hit atmosphere. Level 200 was different. I knew it was different the moment we crossed the threshold from the stairwell onto the level floor. The air changed. It was warmer, heavier, saturated with moisture that beaded on the metal surfaces and ran in thin streams along the walls. The pulse was louder here, a physical vibration that you could feel through the soles of your boots, a rhythm like a heartbeat but slower, deeper, more deliberate, as if whatever was generating it was very large and very patient. The lighting was different too, not the dead darkness of the upper levels or the flickering amber of the damaged lumen systems. There was a glow, a faint, sourceless luminescence that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sickly bluish green that made skin look gray and eyes look hollow and turned the shadows into something thick and tangible. The transit hub was 3 kilometers east of the stairwell, according to the map. 3 kilometers in a straight line, but nothing on level 200 moved in a straight line. The corridors here were changed. Not just decorated or defaced. Changed. The walls had the same organic quality as the hab-block walls above, but more pronounced, more advanced. The metal was barely visible beneath layers of growth that pulsed faintly with the rhythm from below, biomechanical accretions that looked like tumors or barnacles, or the fruiting bodies of some enormous fungal organism. The floor was uneven, buckled, and warped into ridges and depressions that made walking treacherous. The ceiling dripped, not water. A clear viscous fluid that dropped from overhead in slow, heavy strands and pooled in the depressions on the floor. Tolvet caught some on her gloved hand and examined it and said nothing, but her jaw tightened and she wiped her hand on her trouser leg 3 times in quick succession. We had gone perhaps a kilometer into level 200 when we encountered the shrine. I call it a shrine because I have no better word for it. It occupied a space that had been a communal water distribution point, a broad circular chamber with pipes and valve assemblies and the rusted hulks of purification units. All of that was still there underneath, but something had been built on top of it, a structure made of metal and bone and the organic wall growth and things I could not identify, rising from the center of the chamber to nearly touch the ceiling, a twisted spire of accumulated material that branched and forked like a diseased tree. And at its base, arranged in concentric circles on the floor, were offerings, weapons, clothing, personal items, identity tags, and bodies, not dead, not alive, something between. Men and women and things that had been men and women, fused to the floor by the organic growth, their bodies partially absorbed into the material, their faces still visible and still moving, mouths opening and closing in silent repetition, eyes tracking, aware. They were embedded in the floor like insects in amber, and they were conscious, and they had been here for a long time. Private Grunn started screaming. I do not blame her. Sergeant Pael silenced her with a hand over her mouth and a sharp word in her ear, and she stopped screaming, but she did not stop shaking, and she did not stop until we were out of the shrine chamber and 200 meters down the corridor. And even then her hands were vibrating so badly she could not hold her las rifle, and Tolvet had to administer a mild sedative from the medikit. I did not scream. I want credit for that. I did not scream because I could not, because my throat had closed and my lungs had forgotten how to work, and my body had decided that the appropriate response to what I was seeing was to shut down all non-essential systems and devote every resource to the single task of not collapsing. I stood at the entrance to that shrine chamber and I looked at those people in the floor, and I felt something inside me shift, a foundation stone moving, a load-bearing wall cracking, and I understood for the first time in my life what the ecclesiarchy means when they talk about the threat of chaos. Not the military threat, not the political threat, the existential threat, the threat to the idea of being human. Because what had been done to those people in the floor was not destruction, it was transformation. They were becoming part of something else. They were being incorporated into a structure that had no reference point in the human experience, a structure that did not care about them as individuals, that did not hate them or love them or want anything from them except their substance, their material, their flesh and bone and the energy that lived in their cells. They were raw material. They were being used. Standing there, looking at those conscious faces pressed into the floor of a shrine they had not chosen, I understood what the ecclesiarchy had been trying to tell us all along. Chaos is not the roaring demon. It is the idea that a person and a brick are the same thing. Raw material, interchangeable. And the people in the floor were learning that lesson from the inside. Gravan looked at the shrine and his face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a recalculation, an adjustment of internal parameters. He turned to his adjutant and said, "Send a burst transmission to Resurgent Blade. Priority Vermilion. Report level 200. Compromised, extensive chaos, corruption. Civilian population status. Non-recoverable. Request Adeptus Astar Tess support if available. Advance continuing toward Transit Hub. Priority Vermilion. The highest urgency designation available to a line officer. It meant help us. It meant this is beyond what we can handle. It meant, in the clinical language of the Astra Militarum, we are in trouble. The adjutant sent the burst. Whether it reached the ship, we did not know. Whether anyone was listening, we did not know. Whether help was coming, we did not know. We knew one thing. The transit hub was 2 kilometers ahead, and the mission had not changed, and we were soldiers of the Imperium, and soldiers advance. The 2 kilometers to the transit hub should have been the hardest fighting of the campaign. We expected fortified positions, massed traitor guard, possibly heavy weapons emplacements. What we found was worse than resistance. We found nothing. The corridors leading to the hub were empty. Not just unoccupied, empty in a way that felt deliberate, staged, like a path that had been swept clean and lit and made ready for guests who were expected and welcome. The organic growth on the walls thinned as we advanced, receding like a tide pulling back from a shore. The floor leveled out, smooth and clean, the bluish-green glow intensified, providing enough light to see by without stab lights. The pulse from below synchronized with our footsteps, no matter how we tried to break the rhythm, adjusting itself to match our pace as if the entire hive was aware of our movement and was accommodating it. Sergeant Pael did not like it. I could tell because his hand went to the Aquila pendant he wore under his collar and his thumb rubbed across the surface, a gesture I had seen him make exactly twice before, both times when something was about to go very wrong. He said nothing about his misgivings to the squad. He said something to Graven, a short exchange that I could not hear, and Graven's response was a curt nod and a hand signal that meant, "Continue advance." We continued. What else could we do? The mission was the transit hub. The mission was always the transit hub. The first sign that something was specifically, deliberately, intentionally wrong came from Tolvet. She had been monitoring her medi-scanner intermittently throughout the descent, taking atmospheric readings and checking for toxins and biological contaminants. She pulled me aside at a corridor junction, out of the main column's earshot, and showed me the scanner display. I am not a medic, and the readings did not mean much to me, but Tolvet translated. "The air quality is improving," she said. "That is good." "No, it is not. We are on a chaos-corrupted level of a hive that has been lost for 3 years. The air should be getting worse as we go deeper. More contamination, more biological agents, more warp resonance in the atmospheric particulates. Instead, it is getting cleaner, as if the corruption is pulling back from our path, as if something is making room for us." "Why would it do that?" She looked at me with those steady, unreadable eyes. Why does a predator clear a path? Why does a trap have an open door? I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to say that maybe the air systems on this level were better maintained, or the corruption was naturally thinner near the transit hub, or any of a dozen rational explanations that did not involve the conclusion she was pointing me toward. But I could not, because I had been feeling it too. The wrongness of the easy advance. The discomfort of moving through enemy territory without meeting resistance. The sense, growing stronger with every step, that we were not fighting our way to the transit hub. We were being escorted. I told Ossev. He told me that he already knew. He said that the voices in the walls had changed. They were not whispering anymore. They were singing. A low, tuneless hum that threaded through the ambient noise of the hive, weaving between the pulse and the dripping and the distant mechanical sounds, a melody that had no structure he could identify, but that carried a feeling he could not shake. Anticipation. The hive was anticipating something. It was waiting. It was ready. I should have gone to Gravin. I should have spoken up, reported what Tolvet had found, pushed for a reassessment of the advance. I did not. I was a private, a fresh trooper with 22 months of service and one combat engagement that involved livestock. I did not have the standing to challenge an officer's tactical decision, and I did not have the language to articulate what I was feeling in terms that a military briefing would accept. What was I going to say? Sir, the hive feels wrong. Sir, the walls are singing. Sir, I think we are walking into a trap because the medic's scanner shows the air is too clean, and my friend says the voices sound happy. Gravin would have looked at me the way officers look at soldiers who are breaking under combat stress, with professional sympathy and a referral to the attached Ministorum chaplain. And we would have kept advancing anyway. So I said nothing. I shouldered my las rifle and I walked, and I listened to the singing in the walls, and I waited for whatever was coming. The transit hub appeared out of the bluish-green glow like a cathedral emerging from fog. It was enormous. I had seen the specifications on the briefing slates. I knew it was large, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing it physically are different orders of understanding. The hub was a cavern, a vast artificial space carved into the body of the hive, a nexus point where 12 major transit lines converged, ringed with platforms and loading bays and control towers and the dormant hulks of mass transit vehicles that sat on their rails like sleeping animals. The ceiling was 50 meters above us, supported by columns that rose like the trunks of ancient trees, and the floor stretched away in every direction, hundreds of meters of open space that our 200 troopers could not hope to fill, let alone defend. It was empty. The transit hub was empty. No defenders, no cultists, no traitor guard, no corrupted civilians, just us and the space, and the bluish-green light that came from everywhere and nowhere. And the pulse that was so strong here that I could see it. Actually see it in the faint ripple of the fluid that pooled on the floor, a rhythmic disturbance like a heartbeat made visible. Gravin ordered us into the hub. We spread out across the nearest platform, establishing a perimeter with overlapping fields of fire, heavy weapons covering the approach corridors and the open floor. It was textbook. It was professional. It was exactly what we had been trained to do. And it felt wrong. Every instinct I had, the animal instincts that live below conscious thought, was screaming at me that this was not a strong point we had captured. This was a destination we had been guided to. The transit hub was where we were supposed to be. Not because the Astra Militarum wanted us here, because something else did. The confirmation came 37 minutes after we secured the perimeter. It came from below. The floor of the transit hub was not solid. It was a deck, a metal surface laid over the structural framework of the hive, and below it was another level, a maintenance substructure that housed the transit system's power conduits and control mechanisms. We had not explored the substructure because we did not have the numbers to secure both the hub and the spaces beneath it, and Gravin had made the tactical decision to hold the high ground and let the substructure wait. The substructure did not wait. The sound came first, not the pulse, something new. A chanting, hundreds of voices in unison, rising from below the deck in a tide of sound that washed over us and through us and made the metal vibrate under our feet. Words in a language I did not recognize, guttural and liquid at the same time, syllables that seemed to have too many consonants and not enough vowels. Words that felt wrong in the ear the way the corridors felt wrong to the eye. Shapes that human speech was not designed to hold. Then the light. The bluish-green glow that had been ambient and diffuse suddenly concentrated. It flowed across the floor like liquid, gathering in channels and grooves that I had not noticed before, channels that had been cut into the metal deck in patterns, in lines, in geometric formations that converged on a central point in the middle of the hub. An 8-pointed star, vast, encompassing the entire floor of the hub. We were standing on it. We had walked into it without seeing it because the channels had been shallow and dark, and the light had not been in them yet. And now the light was in them, and the star was blazing beneath our feet, and the chanting was rising, and the pulse was accelerating, and I understood. I understood everything. The understanding was not mine. It was not something I reasoned or deduced or pieced together from evidence. It was pushed into me, forced through whatever channel the ritual had opened between itself and the souls it was consuming. An unwanted clarity that filled my mind as the bluish-green light filled the channels in the floor. I did not want to know these things. The ritual did not care what I wanted. We were not here to take the transit hub. We were here because the transit hub was the site of a ritual that required a specific ingredient that the corrupted population of Prathenmire could not provide because they were already given to chaos, already marked, already claimed. The ritual needed unmarked souls, Imperial souls, souls that still carried the Emperor's light, however faintly, because it was that light that the ritual was designed to consume. We were not soldiers capturing an objective. We were sacrifices walking to the altar. But it was worse than that. The understanding came in stages, each one more sickening than the last, like peeling layers from something rotten. The ritual did not simply need our presence. It needed our violence. Every corrupted civilian we had killed on the way down, every smiling face we had shot in the dark corridors, every body we had stepped over, every trigger pull, every last bolt that had ended a life that chaos had already claimed, all of it had been feeding the mechanism. The act of killing, performed by hands that still served the Emperor, directed at flesh that had been consecrated to the ruinous powers. Each death was a transaction, a transfer of energy from one account to another, and we had been making payments since the first corridor. The civilians had not been sent to stop us. They had been sent to be killed by us. The traitor guard in the stairwell, fighting to the last man, dying with conviction. That conviction was the point. Their willingness to die was the offering, and our willingness to kill was the key that turned it. Every engagement, every ambush, every wave of black-eyed bodies that we had cut down with increasing efficiency and decreasing hesitation. All of it. Fuel. We had been charging the ritual with every step of our descent, and by the time we walked into the transit hub, we were so soaked in the energy of what we had done that the star beneath our feet barely needed to pull. We had already given it almost everything it needed. The children. Emperor, forgive me. The children on level 202. I understood now why they had been there, why they had been shaped to provoke maximum hesitation followed by maximum violence, why the corruption had left their faces unsmiling and their voices plaintive and their bodies small. Because the act of killing them, the specific horror of that act, performed by souls that still carried the light, was worth more to the ritual than 100 dead cultists. We had been played, not just strategically, spiritually. The thing below us had understood our psychology with a precision that would have impressed a Departamento Munitorum behavioral analyst, and it had arranged every encounter on our descent to extract the maximum possible yield from our capacity for righteous violence. The entire campaign, the drop, the scattered landing, the horrors that funneled us downward, the empty corridors that guided us here, all of it had been choreographed. All of it had been arranged. The enemy had not been trying to stop us. They had been hurting us, and we had not merely walked to the altar. We had built it, one kill at a time, with our own hands. Gravan saw it too. I could see the realization cross his face, the moment of understanding that transformed from confusion to comprehension to horror in the space of a breath. He was a competent officer, a good officer, and he reacted the way a good officer reacts when he realizes his command has been led into a killing ground. He gave the order to withdraw. Immediately, all units, back the way we came, out of the hub, up the stairwells, fight through anything in the way, get out, get clear, get above the ritual's reach. The order came too late. The corridors we had come through, the clean and empty corridors that had welcomed us so graciously, were no longer empty. They were full, packed wall to wall with corrupted civilians, thousands of them, tens of thousands, more people than I had seen in one place in my entire life, standing shoulder to shoulder in the corridor mouths, blocking every exit from the hub, their two wide smiles gleaming in the bluish-green light, their black eyes reflecting the glow of the ritual star beneath our feet. They were not attacking. They were containing. They were the walls of the trap, and the trap was closed. Behind us, below us, the chanting intensified. The light in the channels flared brighter. The pulse became a drumbeat, rapid and urgent, and I felt something pull at me, not physically, not a force on my body, but a pull on something inside my body, something deeper than muscle or bone, something essential. My vision blurred, my knees weakened. Beside me, Ossev gasped and staggered and caught himself on my shoulder, and across the perimeter I could see other troopers swaying, stumbling, reaching for supports, as if the gravity had suddenly doubled or the floor had tilted beneath us. The ritual was activating. We were fueling it. Our presence, our lives, our souls, whatever you want to call the thing that makes a person more than a collection of meat and impulses, it was being drawn out of us, slowly, gently, almost tenderly, like a surgeon draining blood from a patient. Not enough to kill, not yet, just enough to weaken, to immobilize, to make the final extraction easier when the time came. Gravan did the only thing he could do, except he was not the first to think of it. Grunn was. Private Grunn, the thin woman who had heard voices and almost opened doors, and whose lips had been moving in silent conversation with something none of us could hear. Grunn screamed it before Gravan gave the order. She screamed it from the middle of the formation with a voice that was not entirely her own, a voice that had harmonics in it, undertones that did not belong to a human throat. "The floor," she screamed. "Break the star! Break the lines! They told me! They showed me! It is in the floor!" And then she turned to Hanneth and grabbed the heavy bolter's barrel and physically wrenched it downward toward the deck, and Hanneth, who trusted instinct more than protocol, pulled the trigger. Gravan, to his credit, understood instantly and made it an order. He ordered every heavy weapons trooper to target the floor. Not the corridors, not the crowds of corrupted civilians. The floor, the ritual star. If you cannot escape the trap, destroy the trap. If you cannot fight the enemy, fight the ground the enemy has chosen. The heavy bolter roared. 3 other heavy weapons opened up simultaneously. 2 more heavy bolters and an autocannon that someone from 3rd Squad had carried through the entire descent. They fired into the deck, plating at the channels where the light was flowing, chewing up the metal, breaking the geometric patterns, disrupting the lines of the star. The effect was immediate. The bluish-green light flickered and sputtered where the channels were broken. The chanting faltered, lost its rhythm, fractured into discordant syllables. The pull on whatever it was pulling eased slightly, enough that I could stand straight again, enough that the fog in my head thinned and the world came back into hard, sharp focus. And the corrupted civilians in the corridors began to scream, not the harmonic chord of the earlier encounters, a sound of pain, of disruption, of a vast organism being injured in one of its extremities. They screamed and they surged forward, no longer containing, now attacking, a tide of bodies pouring into the transit hub from every corridor mouth. Thousands of them, a flood of flesh and black eyes and two wide smiles, coming to protect the ritual that we were destroying. What followed was the worst fighting I have ever experienced, or hope to experience. Fewer than 200 Imperial Guard troopers in a circle of light, firing outward into a sea of bodies that just kept coming, wave after wave, the dead piling up in mounds that the living climbed over without slowing, without hesitating, driven by a will that was not their own toward a purpose they probably could not have articulated. Hanneth kept firing into the floor between waves, breaking more of the channels, disrupting more of the star. And every time a line broke, the light dimmed and the pull weakened, and the chanting from below became more ragged, more desperate. But the waves kept coming, and we were taking losses. Lass fire from the traitor guard elements mixed in with the civilian masses. Auto guns, crude melee weapons, fists and teeth and those blackened nails, troopers falling, the perimeter shrinking. Graven took a last bolt through the upper chest and went down. His adjutant dragged him behind a cargo pallet, and Tolvet ran to him, bent over him, worked on him with the efficiency that was her hallmark, her hands moving fast and sure while the world came apart around her. I did not see if Graven survived. I was busy. Everyone was busy. Busy surviving. Busy killing. Busy being the function that combat had made us, stripped of everything except the mechanical act of point and fire and do not stop. The ritual star broke, not all at once. In stages, each broken channel dimmed a section of the pattern. Each dimmed section weakened the pull. The chanting from below became screaming, inhuman screaming, the sound of something vast and formless, thrashing in frustration as its mechanism was dismantled, piece by a handful of soldiers with heavy weapons, and the stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to die. That is the defining characteristic of the Astra Militarum, at its best and most desperate. When the last channel broke and the light died and the pull vanished and the chanting stopped, there was a moment of silence that was louder than any sound I have ever heard. A held breath, a gap in the world, and then the corrupted civilians in the corridors stopped. All of them. Simultaneously. They stopped moving, and their mouths closed, and their black eyes went wide, and they stood there, swaying slightly like marionettes whose strings had been cut, but who had not yet fallen. Then they fell, all of them, at once. 30,000, 40,000, 60,000 bodies collapsing to the floor in a single wave of cessation, and the sound of it was like rain on a metal roof. A soft, continuous, papery sound of flesh hitting ground. And then silence. Real silence. For the first time since we had hit atmosphere, the pulse was gone. The hive was quiet. The voices in the walls were silent. The singing had stopped. Whatever had been animating the corrupted population of Hive Vrannek, whatever will had been directing them, coordinating them, using them as instruments of its purpose, it had withdrawn, not destroyed. I knew even then that we had not destroyed it. We had disrupted its ritual. We had broken its mechanism. But the thing itself, the intelligence behind the corruption, the will behind the chanting, it was still down there in the depths of the hive, in the places where the light of the Emperor had never reached even before the fall. It was down there, and it was angry, and it was patient, and it would try again. But not today. Today, for this moment, the silence was ours. I sat down on the floor of the transit hub. I did not choose to sit. My legs simply stopped working, and I went down, folding at the knees and hips, and I sat there with my las rifle across my lap, and I looked at the carnage around me. The dead, ours and theirs. The broken floor where the ritual star had been, metal torn and twisted, channels shattered, the geometry of whatever had been planned here reduced to rubble and ruin. The bodies of the corrupted civilians, mounds and drifts of them, filling the corridor mouths, covering the platform floor, so many that you could not see the metal beneath them. We had started the day with 206 troopers. I counted heads. I counted because it was a thing I could do that required no thought, and no courage, and no strength. Just the simple act of looking and numbering, 1 and 1 and 1. 119. We had lost 87, almost half, in a single engagement, in a place we should never have been, fighting a battle we did not understand against an enemy we could not see. Ossev was alive. He was sitting beside me. He was not talking. Hanneth was alive, reloading the heavy bolter with hands that moved on pure muscle memory, her face blank, her eyes distant. Tolvet was alive, moving between the wounded, triaging, treating, her medical supplies nearly exhausted, her face as steady and unreadable as ever. Sergeant Pael was alive, standing at the edge of the perimeter, looking out at the dead, his hand on the Aquila pendant under his collar. Morghaven was alive. Barely. Tolvet had stabilized him, but he needed surgery, real surgery, not field medicine, and there was no surgery to be had in the transit hub of a dead hive on a damned world. He was conscious enough to transfer command to Pael, who accepted it with a nod and nothing else. We held the transit hub. That was the mission. Hold the transit hub. Control movement through the hive. Establish a strong point for the follow-up forces. Mission accomplished. The fact that we had been lured here as sacrificial components of a chaos ritual was, from a strictly tactical perspective, irrelevant. The hub was ours. The mission was complete. The cost was 87 dead and dozens wounded and something broken in every single one of us that would never be repaired. Mission accomplished. We held the transit hub for 9 hours before they came. 9 hours of silence and waiting and tending to the wounded and stacking the dead. 9 hours of radio static and intermittent Vox contact with First Company, who had taken the anti-air positions on the eastern face and were calling down reinforcement drops. Finally, after more than 30 hours of fighting alone. 9 hours of listening to the hive around us, the quiet hive, the empty hive, the hive that was waiting just as we were waiting, and I think we both knew, the hive and us, that the silence was temporary, that the thing below had not given up, that it was gathering itself for something else, something that did not rely on rituals and geometric patterns and the slow extraction of imperial souls. Something direct, something simple, something that understood the language of violence as well as we did. During those 9 hours, I learned things about myself that I would have preferred not to know. I learned that I could sit beside a mound of dead bodies and eat a ration bar without nausea. I learned that the sound of a wounded man crying for his mother stops being unbearable after the first hour and becomes background noise by the third. I learned that exhaustion, true exhaustion, the kind that goes past physical tiredness into a state of disconnection from your own body, produces a clarity that is almost peaceful. Everything becomes simple. Breathe, drink water, check your weapon. Watch the corridor. Repeat. The complex architecture of human thought, the worries and hopes and regrets and plans that normally fill the space between your ears, all of it collapses into a single narrow corridor of purpose, and you walk down that corridor and you do not look at the doors on either side because you know what is behind them and you cannot afford to open them yet. Ossev sat with me for most of those 9 hours. We did not talk much. There was nothing to talk about that would not have required opening those doors. Instead, we sat shoulder to shoulder and shared water and checked each other's equipment and performed the small rituals of maintenance that soldiers perform when there is nothing else to do. The stripping and cleaning and reassembly of weapons that serves no practical purpose when the weapon is already clean, but serves every psychological purpose, because it gives your hands something to do, and your mind something to focus on, and your fear something to hide behind. At one point, deep into the 6th hour, Ossev said, "When we get back to Morghaven, when this is done, I am going to buy a house. You cannot afford a house. I will save. It will take years, but I am going to do it. A house on the northern plateau, up where the wind comes off the glaciers and the air is so cold it hurts to breathe and there is nothing for 100 kilometers in any direction except rock and sky. I am going to buy a house, and I am going to sit on the porch, and I am going to listen to the wind, and I am not going to go inside any building larger than 3 rooms for the rest of my natural life." "That sounds good. You can visit if you want, but you have to knock first." "I will knock." "Good. It is settled then." It was the closest thing to a plan for the future that either of us had made since we left Morghaven. It was the closest thing to hope. It was a small, fragile thing, a house on a plateau that did not exist yet, and we held it between us like a candle in the dark and pretended it was enough to see by. Tolvet told me during those hours that Gravan had died. Quiet, without fuss, his body simply running out of the resources it needed to continue functioning despite the damage it had sustained. She told me this in the same flat, clinical tone she used for everything, and then she went back to work on a trooper whose left arm had been crushed by a falling body during the last wave and who was going to lose the arm if he did not get to a proper medical facility within the next 12 hours. She did not stop working. I never saw Tolvet Hinn stop working. I think work was to her what the house on the plateau was to Ossev. A thing to hold on to, a structure to inhabit when the world outside the structure became uninhabitable. Pael was in command now, and command suited him like a weight suits a pack mule, not comfortably, not elegantly, but with a functional adequacy that got the job done. He reorganized our forces, redistributed ammunition, set watch rotations, sent scouts into the nearest corridors to establish early warning positions. He did these things with the methodical competence of a senior non-commissioned officer who had been soldiering since before most of us were born. And his calm was infectious, as calm always is when it comes from someone you trust. Grun was sitting against a column at the edge of the perimeter. She had not spoken since the scream. Her las rifle was on the ground beside her, untouched. Her lips were moving. They had not stopped moving since the ritual broke, forming words in a language that was not Low Gothic and was not any language I recognized, a continuous, silent monologue that she seemed unaware she was performing. Tolvet had examined her and found nothing physically wrong. Her vitals were stable, her pupils were normal, but her lips kept moving and her eyes were focused on something that the rest of us could not see, a middle distance that existed between the real and the somewhere else. And when I knelt beside her and said her name, she looked at me and smiled. A normal smile, a human smile. And she said, "They are angry. They are so angry, Cohl, and they are not finished." Then her eyes unfocused again, and her lips resumed their silent recitation, and I stood up and walked away because there was nothing I could do for her, and staying close to her made my skin crawl in a way that I am not proud of, but cannot deny. Pael was not fearless. I had seen fear on his face several times, but his fear was a tool he used rather than a condition he suffered, a heightening of awareness and readiness that made him sharper rather than slower, and watching him work gave me something to aspire to. Not courage. I do not think courage is something you can aspire to. Courage is what happens when fear meets duty and duty wins the argument. What Pael had was competence, and competence in the face of catastrophe is its own form of defiance against the dark. They came at the 33rd hour. The Vox crackled first. A burst of static and then a voice, broken and fragmentary, from one of the scout positions in the eastern corridor. 3 words before the transmission dissolved into noise and then silence. Contact something. Big. Then the screaming started, not from the scouts, from below. From the maintenance substructure beneath the transit hub floor, the same space where the chanting had originated, the space we had not explored because we did not have the numbers. The screaming was not human, and it was not the harmonic chord of the corrupted civilians. It was deeper, rawer, a sound that seemed to come from a throat much larger than any human throat, a bellow of rage and purpose that vibrated through the deck, plating and up through our boots and into our bones. The floor ruptured, not where the ritual star had been. 20 meters to the east, near the edge of the platform, the deck plating buckled upward and then tore apart, peeling back like the skin of a fruit, and something came through the hole. Something tall, something armored, something that moved with a fluidity that should not have been possible for a figure in full tactical plate, a grace that was predatory and intentional and wrong. A Chaos Space Marine. I had never seen a Space Marine of any allegiance. Most guardsmen never do. They are rare, the Adeptus Astartes, even the corrupted ones. You hear about them. You see picked captures in briefings. You know the statistics, the size, the strength, the speed, the lethality. But statistics are just numbers, and numbers do not prepare you for the reality of a transhuman killing machine that stands half again as tall as the tallest man you have ever met. It was encased in power armor that was once noble and is now a canvas of horror, ceramite plates covered in trophies and markings and growths that should not be there, a helm that has been reshaped into something between a face and a skull, eyes that glow with a light that is not reflection. He came through the floor and he brought others with him, 7 more climbing through the breach in the deck, each one different, each one a monument to a different aspect of corruption. One wore armor that wept a clear fluid from every joint, the ceramite slick and glistening. Another had antlers, actual antlers, growing from his helm and shoulders, branching bone structures that crackled with pale electricity. A third was enormous even by Space Marine standards, his armor swollen and distended, the plates barely containing whatever was growing inside them. They were not of one legion. Their armor bore different colors, different marks, different histories. They were a war band, a gathering of the damned, united not by loyalty or brotherhood, but by the will of the powers they served. Chaos undivided. The ruinous powers in concert, acting through their chosen instruments. The lead one, the first through the floor, carried a sword that was longer than I am tall. The blade was black, and it moved. Not in his hand. The blade itself moved, rippling, as if the metal was liquid held in the shape of a sword by an act of will, and where the ripples passed, the air around the blade distorted, blurring, the way air blurs above a fire, except colder, pulling at the light rather than pushing it. He looked at us. 119 guardsmen on a platform, surrounded by the dead, armed with las guns and determination and the ragged remains of our faith. He looked at us the way a man looks at a task that is beneath his attention, but must be completed nonetheless, without hatred, without respect, without anything that I could recognize as emotion, the blank assessment of a tool measuring a material. Then he moved. I have heard it said that a Chaos Space Marine in combat is like a natural disaster with intent. That is wrong. Natural disasters are impersonal. They do not choose their victims. They do not adjust their approach based on observation and analysis. What came at us was worse than a natural disaster, because it was intelligent and it was skilled, and it had been killing since before the founding of my homeworld's first settlement. Centuries of combat experience distilled into a single fluid motion as the lead Marine crossed the 20 meters between the breach and our perimeter in the time it took me to raise my las rifle, and the sword came down, and Trooper Meskrin, who had been standing at the edge of the platform, ceased to exist from the collarbones up. Hanneth opened fire. The heavy bolter rounds hit the Marine's chest plate, and I saw the impacts, the detonations, the ceramite cracking and spalling, and the Marine did not stop. He staggered, one step back, then forward again into Hanneth's fire, walking through the stream of mass reactive shells as though they were nothing more than rain, annoyed but not deterred. The other Marines were spreading out, engaging our perimeter at multiple points, and the organized defensive structure that Pael had built was collapsing, not through any failure of discipline, but through the simple mathematical reality that a las gun does not stop a transhuman in corrupted power armor, not with 1 shot, not with 10, and by the time you have fired 10 shots, the transhuman is close enough to kill you with its hands. Sergeant Pael did something then that I will carry in my memory until the day I die and probably beyond. He stepped forward, not back, forward, toward the lead Marine. He had a melta bomb in his hand. Emperor knows where he had gotten it. I had not seen one in our supply allocation, and he ran at the Marine and he activated the bomb, and he threw himself at the corrupted giant's legs, wrapping his arms around the armored thigh, trying to bring the melta bomb into contact with the armor at the joint where the leg met the hip, the weakest point. The Marine looked down at him. That dead stare, the calculation behind the eye lenses. And then the sword came around in a horizontal arc that was almost casual, almost lazy, and Sergeant Orrund Pael, who had served the Emperor for 23 years and had led us through the worst day of our lives with competence and calm and the quiet courage of a man who knows exactly how afraid he is and does his duty anyway, was gone. But the melta bomb was still there, maglocked to the armor where Pael had placed it, and when it detonated 2 seconds later, the shaped thermal charge melted through the corrupted ceramite and the transhuman flesh beneath it, and the lead Marine's right leg ceased to function. He went down on one knee. He did not scream. He did not react at all except to shift his weight and raise the sword for another stroke. Because even on one knee, even with his leg destroyed, a Chaos Space Marine is still more dangerous than anything a guardsman has been trained to fight. Ossev was beside me. He grabbed my arm and pulled me sideways, out of the path of another Marine who was cutting through our position, the one with the antlers. Bolts of pale energy arcing from the bone growths and hitting troopers and leaving them convulsing on the ground. Not dead, worse than dead, their bodies locked in seizures that bent them into shapes the human skeleton was not designed to accommodate. We rolled behind a cargo container and pressed ourselves flat, and Ossev said, fast and quiet, "The breach, in the floor where they came up. There will be more below. If we can collapse it, seal it, stop more from coming through." "How?" "The autocannon. Morren still has the autocannon. If we put sustained fire into the structural supports around the breach, the upper deck should collapse inward. Seal it." "That will not stop the ones already up here." "No, but it will stop the next 8. He was right. He was right, and we both knew it, and we also both knew that getting to Morren, who was 30 meters away behind an overturned transit car, would require crossing open ground that was currently occupied by transhuman killing machines and the chaos of a battle that was less a battle and more a massacre. Ossev looked at me. I looked at him, and something passed between us that was not a word and not a thought, but was an understanding, a recognition, a settling of accounts between two people who have walked through hell together and know each other in the way that only hell can teach. "The house on the plateau," he said. "I will knock first," I said. He grinned. That Ossev grin, the one that made you feel like everything was going to be fine, even when every available piece of evidence said otherwise. Then he stood up and he ran. Not toward Morren, toward the breach in the floor, directly, with a frag grenade in each hand. I understood what he was doing in the same instant that I could not stop him. He was not trying to collapse the breach with the grenades. The grenades would not do that. He was drawing attention. He was pulling the Marine's eyes to himself, to the small, fast figure sprinting across the open deck toward the hole in the floor, because a human running toward you is a threat, and even a transhuman responds to threats. He was giving me the opening I needed to get to Morren. I ran. I ran harder than I have ever run, my boots hammering the metal deck, my las rifle banging against my chest, the world reduced to a tunnel of focus with Morren's position at the end of it. I heard Bolter fire behind me. I heard the deep, percussive bark of a bolt pistol and the crack of las fire and the sound of bodies falling, and I did not look back, because looking back would have cost me a half-second, and a half-second was the difference between reaching Morren and dying on the open deck. I reached him. I threw myself behind the transit car and gasped out what Ossev had said. The breach, the supports, the autocannon. Collapse it. Morren, who was a quiet, methodical man from Morghaven's southern basin, who had never said an unnecessary word in his life, looked at me and nodded and swung the autocannon around and opened fire on the deck, plating around the breach. The autocannon did what heavy weapons do. It unmade things. The structural supports around the breach were already weakened from the Marine's emergence, the metal stressed and bent, and the autocannon rounds punched through them with a sound like a giant snapping fingers, one after another, and the deck began to sag and groan and shift. 10 seconds of sustained fire. 15. The deck around the breach crumpled inward with a shriek of tortured metal, folding down and in on itself, a 5-meter section of platform collapsing into the maintenance substructure below and taking with it the access point, the path, the door through which more nightmares might have climbed. A roar from below. Rage, frustration, the sound of something denied. I looked back then. I looked for Ossev. I found him. He was on the deck 15 meters from where the breach had been. He was on his back. His las rifle was gone. His chest plate was shattered. The front of his flak armor caved in, and there was blood, a lot of blood, more than a body should be able to contain and still function. The Marine with the antlers was standing over him, one armored boot on his chest, the pale energy crackling along the bone growths. And Ossev was looking up at the Marine with an expression that I will never forget. An expression of absolute, terrified, defiant refusal. He was afraid. He was dying. And he was not going to look away. The Marine raised a gauntlet that crackled with that pale energy and reached down toward Ossev's face. And I shot it. I shot the Marine. I shot it with my las rifle, a standard-issue Morghaven pattern las gun that fires a beam of coherent light with roughly the same effect on tactical ceramite as a thrown stone on a fortress wall. And I shot the Marine in the side of the head, where the helm met the gorget, and the last bolt found the seal and bored through, and the Marine flinched. Just flinched. A twitch of the helm, a moment of disruption, the pale energy flickering. It was enough. Hanneth, throne bless her, had been waiting for an opening, any opening, and she put a sustained burst from the heavy bolter into the same spot. The helm seal, the weakness I had exposed, and heavy bolter rounds are not lasgun rounds. They are mass-reactive, explosive, designed to penetrate armor and detonate inside, and the Marine's head came apart in a spray of ceramite fragments and something darker underneath, and the body toppled sideways off of Ossev and hit the deck with a crash that I felt through the platform. I ran to him. Ossev. I knelt beside him, and I put my hands on the ruin of his chest armor, and I pressed down as if pressure could hold a broken body together, as if wanting it badly enough could reverse the damage that a transhuman's boot had done to human ribs and the things they protect. His eyes found mine. They were clear, afraid, alive. "Did it work?" he said. His voice was wet. "It worked. The breach is sealed." A smile, small, tight. "Good." A pause, a breath that sounded like something tearing. "The house, Jevrik." "I know. Build it for me." "I will." "Knock first." "I will." He closed his eyes. He did not open them again. I do not remember the rest of the fight clearly. That is not a failure of memory. It is a mercy of it. The mind, when presented with more than it can process, begins to edit. It stores the essential and discards the rest, filing it away in a place that dreams can access, but waking thought cannot. And what remains is a series of images, sharp and disconnected, like pages torn from a book and scattered on the floor. I remember the kneeling Marine, the one Pael had crippled, being surrounded by troopers who fired into it from every angle, pouring lass fire into the damaged armor until the ceramite glowed and cracked, and the thing inside stopped moving. And even then they kept firing, because stopping felt like an invitation for it to get up again. I remember the bloated Marine catching Morren with a backhand swing that launched him 8 meters through the air and into a support column with a sound I can still hear when the nights are quiet. I remember Tolvet Hinn, our medic, whose composure had long since passed from courage into something mechanical, picking up a dead trooper's las gun and firing it into a Marine's knee joint from point-blank range. Her face as calm and clinical as if she were administering a dose of counterseptic. I remember the weeping Marine, the one whose armor leaked that clear fluid, slipping on the blood-slicked deck and going down on one hand, and 6 troopers swarming it with bayonets and combat knives, stabbing at the joints, the eye lenses, the breathing grill, anywhere that might be vulnerable, and finding vulnerability in the neck seal and pushing a blade through it and twisting. I remember the sound the Marine made when the blade went in. A sound of surprise, as if, after centuries of warfare, the concept of being mortally wounded by a human with a knife was so novel, so unexpected, that it required a moment of genuine astonishment before death. 7 of the 8 Marines died in the transit hub, 7 killed by guardsmen, by mortals, by men and women with las guns and knives and grenades, and the absolute refusal to accept that they were supposed to lose. The 8th did not fight. I want to be clear about this because it matters, because it is the thing that I think about in the hours before dawn when the mind circles its darkest rooms. The 8th Marine, the one in dark armor with no markings, no trophies, no visible corruption, stood at the edge of the battle for its entire duration and did not fire a single shot. It stood with its arms at its sides and its helm tilted slightly, watching, observing, while its brothers bled and died around it, while guardsmen swarmed them with bayonets and heavy bolters, while the transit hub became a charnel house. It stood still and it watched the way a Skolam instructor watches students performing a drill, evaluating, taking notes. I saw it clearly in the final moments of the fight when the last of the other Marines was going down. It was looking at me, not at the battle, at me, Jevrik Cohl, private, nobody. And in its eye lenses, which glowed a dull amber in the bluish-green light, I saw something that was worse than hatred, and worse than hunger, and worse than the blank assessment that the lead Marine had shown us. I saw interest, genuine, focused, personal interest. The way a researcher looks at a specimen that has done something unexpected. The way an architect looks at a structure that has survived a stress test it was not designed to pass. It held my gaze for 3 heartbeats. Then it nodded. A small, precise movement of the helm. An acknowledgement. And then it turned and walked, not ran, walked to the collapsed breach in the deck and pulled the rubble aside with its gauntlets, clearing a path with methodical efficiency, and descended back into the dark beneath the transit hub. It left like someone departing a meeting that has concluded to his satisfaction. It left with the data it had come for. We did not win the transit hub. I understood that then. We passed a test, and the thing that had administered the test had recorded the results and taken them back to whatever lived in the deep places of Prathenmire, and the results would inform whatever came next. The next ritual, the next trap, the next time the Imperium sent soldiers into the dark. They would know us better because of what we had shown them. Our courage, our tactics, our breaking points, our capacity to surprise. All of it catalogued, all of it filed away for future use. We had not defeated the enemy. We had educated it. 53. That was the number. 53 troopers standing when the last corrupted Marine fell. 53 out of the 206 who had entered the transit hub. 53 out of the 460 who had dropped from the Valkyries into the burning air above Prathenmire. 53, and many of those wounded, bleeding, broken in ways that Tolvet's depleted medkit could not fix. But alive. Alive and holding the transit hub. And when the reinforcement drops finally came, 8 hours later, when the sky above the Hive filled with the roar of Valkyrie engines and the thunder of drop pods and the sharp crack of bulk landers breaking atmosphere, we were still there, still standing, still holding. The transit hub of Hive Vrannek, level 200, in the hands of the Astra Militarum. In our hands. During those 8 hours while we waited for the sound of engines that might never come, I heard Ossev's voice. Not from the walls, not from below, not from any external source that I could identify. It came from inside my own head, in the space behind my temples, where thoughts form before they become words, and it was his voice, perfectly his voice, the tone and the cadence and the particular way he emphasized certain syllables and swallowed others. It said the things he would have said. It said, "This is just plumbing, Jevrik. Messy plumbing, but plumbing." It said, "You look terrible. Have you eaten?" It said, "The porch should face east. I want to see the sun come up. I have had enough of the dark." I sat with Ossev's body for those 8 hours. Someone had covered his face with his field jacket, and I sat beside him and I listened to the voice in my head, and I tried to determine what it was. Memory. It could have been memory. The mind, under extreme stress, reaches for comfort, and the most available comfort was the voice of the person who had always made things bearable. My own brain performing an emergency function, generating the one stimulus that could keep me operational. That is the rational explanation. That is the explanation that the Ministorum priest would have approved of, the one that does not require uncomfortable questions about what the warp does to the soul of a dead man on a chaos world. But the voice knew things that memory should not know. It said, "Grun is getting worse. Keep an eye on her." I had not been thinking about Grun. I had not been looking at Grun. But I looked then, and she was on her feet, walking toward one of the corridor mouths, her lips still moving, her eyes fixed on the dark. And Tolvet intercepted her and led her back to the perimeter. The voice in my head said, "See? Plumbing. You have to watch the valves." I do not know what spoke to me in Ossev's voice during those 8 hours. I do not know if it was my grief wearing a familiar shape, or something else wearing a familiar shape, or in some way that I cannot explain and do not expect anyone to believe. Actually him, some echo or residue or fragment of the man I had known, persisting in a place where the boundary between life and death had been thinned by 3 years of corruption. I do not know. I never will know. And the not knowing is the part that I carry the way I carry the children, and the bone corridors, and the smell of copper, in the place where the things that cannot be resolved go to live forever. The reinforcements brought everything. Whole regiments, armored divisions, mechanized infantry, artillery, Indian seers and tech priests and ministorum chaplains and commissars, and the vast logistical apparatus of an imperial crusade force that had been waiting in orbit for more than 40 hours while we died in the dark. They came through the hub, and they spread out through the hive, and they began the long, grinding, brutal work of cleansing Prathenmire, level by level, corridor by corridor, room by room. It would take months. Years, probably. The corruption ran deep, deeper than the transit hub, deeper than the maintenance substructures, down into the foundations of the hive itself, into the bedrock, into the bones of the world. Prathenmire would be reclaimed. The Imperium does not abandon what belongs to it, but the reclamation would be measured in decades and lives, and the slow, steady erasure of everything the hive had been before. Because you cannot save a body that has been this thoroughly infected. You can only cut away the diseased parts and hope that what remains is enough to build on. I was evacuated on the third day after the reinforcements landed. Medical transport to the resurgent blade in orbit, then transfer to a hospital ship for treatment of injuries I do not remember receiving. Contusions and lacerations and a hairline fracture in my left wrist that Tolvet said I had probably gotten during the Chaos Marine engagement, but that I could not connect to any specific moment or impact. The body keeps its own records. It does not always share them with the mind. I spent 6 weeks on the hospital ship, 6 weeks of clean sheets and regular meals, and the slow, reluctant return of sleep that was not punctuated by the sound of harmonized screaming and the feeling of a pulse beneath the floor. 6 weeks of staring at the ceiling and thinking about a house on a plateau that I would build even though I could not afford it and did not know how to build a house. I would learn. I had time. There were 31 survivors from 2nd Company, Morghaven, 12th Drop Infantry. 31 out of 460. The regiment as a whole fared somewhat better. 1st Company's losses were lighter. 3rd Company was effectively destroyed during the drop and in the initial hours on the ground. Total regimental casualties were 68%, sufficient to require a full reformation and re-recruitment cycle before the Morghaven 12th could be considered operational again. We were sent home. Back to Morghaven, back to the wind and the cold and the plateaus, where nothing grew except tough grass and the stubborn determination of people who have learned to endure. Hanneth came home. She carried the heavy bolter off the transit hub platform herself, refusing to let the reinforcement troops take it from her, and she carried it onto the medical transport and onto the hospital ship, and she would have carried it back to Morghaven if the Departamento Munitorum had not politely but firmly requisitioned it for redistribution. I think she slept with it during those first weeks. I do not judge her for that. We all had our anchors. Morren did not come home. The column he hit broke his spine in 2 places. He was alive when Tolvet reached him, but he could not feel his legs, and his breathing was shallow and wrong, and he died on the transit hub floor during the wait for reinforcements, quietly, without complaint, the way he had done everything in his life. He had carried the autocannon through the entire descent by himself, a weapon designed for a 2-man crew because his loader had been killed in the stairwell fight on 203, and Morren had simply picked up the weight and kept walking. He did not mention the extra burden to anyone. He was not the kind of man who mentioned things. Tolvet came home. She transferred to a field hospital unit after Prathenmire, and I heard that she served with distinction in 3 subsequent campaigns before requesting reassignment to a training facility on Morghaven, where she now teaches combat medicine to new recruits. I have seen her once since the transit hub. Her face is the same, steady, unreadable. Her hands are the same, sure and quick. If the things she saw on Prathenmire left marks on her, she wears them where no one can see. Grun did not come home, not to Morghaven. She was separated from us on the hospital ship by men in black coats, who did not wear Departamento Munitorum insignia and who did not explain where they were taking her or why. Ordo Hereticus, someone said, though no one confirmed it and no one asked too many questions, because asking questions about the Inquisition is a form of volunteering that no soldier has ever been taught. Her lips were still moving when they led her away. I sometimes wonder what they did with her, whether they found a use for whatever connection had been opened in her skull on level 200, or whether they simply closed the connection by closing the skull. I wonder, too, whether the voices that told her how to break the ritual were the remnants of Prathenmire's dead fighting back through the only channel available to them, or whether the thing in the deep wanted its ritual broken, wanted us to believe we had won, because the real purpose of the exercise was never the ritual at all, but something else, something we were too small and too mortal and too relieved to see. I do not know. Grun might have known. Grun is gone. Sergeant Pael did not come home. You know that already. But I want to say his name again because names are the only immortality that soldiers get, and he deserves to be remembered by someone who saw what he did, who saw him walk toward a nightmare with a melt-a-bomb in his hand, and the decision already made. Sergeant Orrund Pael, Morghaven, 12th Drop Infantry. He held us together when the dark came in, and when the dark came for him, he met it standing. Ossev did not come home. I have been asked, in the time since Prathenmire, what it was like, what it felt like to fight on a chaos world, what the corruption looked like, sounded like, smelled like, what it was like to kill a Chaos Space Marine, what it was like to watch friends die. I have been asked these questions by fellow soldiers and by civilians and by administratum scribes recording campaign histories and by a ministorum priest who wanted to know if my faith had survived the experience. I tell them the truth, which is also a simplification, because the full truth is not something that fits into the shape of an answer. I tell them it was loud and dark, and it smelled like copper and burning and something sweet that I cannot name. I tell them the corruption looks like your home with the furniture moved. I tell them killing a Chaos Space Marine feels like killing a mountain, impossible until it is done, and then you cannot believe the mountain was ever standing. I tell them that watching friends die is not the worst part. The worst part is the moment after, when the world continues without them, and you realize that it will keep continuing, that the universe does not stop for grief, that the war does not pause while you mourn, that the only tribute you can pay to the dead is to remain alive and to carry what they gave you forward into whatever comes next. And when the priest asked if my faith survived, I told him this. On the floor of the transit hub, with Ossev's blood on my hands and the bodies of corrupted space marines cooling on the deck, and the pulse of something ancient and malevolent still throbbing in the deep places of the hive, I reached inside myself and I looked for the fire, the quiet fire, the coal of belief that had been there since Morghaven, since childhood, since the first time I heard the Emperor's name and felt something respond in my chest. I found it, changed, not the warm, simple thing it had been, harder, sharper, forged by what I had seen into something that cut rather than comforted. But there, still burning, still mine. I am 22 years old. I am a drop trooper of the Morghaven 12th, reformed, re-recruited, preparing for the next deployment. I have seen what chaos does to a world and to the people on it, and to the soldiers who come to take it back. I have stood in the dark and listened to the voices and refused to answer. I have lost things that cannot be replaced and gained things that I did not want. And on the northern plateau of Morghaven, where the wind comes off the glaciers and the air is so cold it hurts to breathe, there is a small house with a porch that faces east toward the dawn. I built it. It took me 2 years and most of my savings, and I had to learn carpentry from a manual that was written for agricultural outbuildings. And the walls are not straight and the roof leaks when the wind comes from the south. But it is there. 3 rooms, a porch, a door that faces the direction I promised. Some nights, when the wind drops and the plateau goes quiet, there is a knocking at the door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, patient, the way a friend knocks who knows you are home and is willing to wait. I do not open it. I sit in my chair and I listen and I wait for it to stop. And it always stops, eventually. And the wind picks up again, and the silence fills with the sound of ice and air and distance. And I tell myself it is the wind. I tell myself it is the house settling. I tell myself it is memory, my own broken mind reaching for the one sound it wants most to hear, and finding it in the creak of wood and the rattle of a latch. I tell myself these things, and I do not open the door, because I do not know if what is on the other side is Ossev, or something that learned his knock on level 200 of Hive Vrannek, something that followed me home through the spaces where the warp thins, something that wears the patience of a friend, the way the corruption wore the faces of children. I do not know, and so I sit and I listen and I do not open the door, but I never lock it,